Hello, and thank you to Philip for delivering your presentation through sheer force of personality, whereas my style is much more along the lines of death by PowerPoint, so bear with me. This is very much a personal reflection on garden village thinking, drawn from some project experience at Turley. On the left-hand side, master planning of a garden village in Knowsley, on the fringes of Merseyside. Many of you will know Knowsley. On the right-hand side, some more hypothetical new settlement modelling in North Hertfordshire, the home, of course, of Letchworth Garden City. So I'm just going to be covering a little bit of context, perhaps dabbling in a bit of strategic thinking about this theme, and then maybe application in practice, looking at Holsmead in particular, which was the garden village we saw there in Knowsley. So we all have an image, I think, of what we think health, happiness and harmony looks like. It's not strictly a garden village, it's Letchworth, a garden city, but a clear demonstration, if we needed it, how the projection of a healthy, happy and harmonious environment and community were the foundations of the garden city movement. The suggestion, of course, we've kind of lost that ethos in our planning of places. This is a quote, possibly a good summary of both the purpose of my talk and the conference as a whole, taken from Lee Shostak's time as chair of the TCPA in an introduction to a paper called Health and Garden Cities back in 2013. Just wanted to sort of draw on that particular part of the quote, which I guess is a bit of a lament that the proper consideration of health and happiness has become a bit lost in planning through the course of the 20th century, and there's an opportunity now to put that back at the centre of our agenda. In that context, it is worth reminding ourselves as planning practitioners, of course, that early on this year, the UK adopted the EU directive on EIA requiring consideration of human health in all planning decisions. So things like health impact assessments are now commonplace in the planning world. I think, though, we do need to think a little bit more strategically about health, happiness and harmony. So this is the document that Lee Shostak was introducing, written by actually Dr. Norman McFadden back in 1938. So the TCPA was sort of resurrecting it as a piece of evidence building, as you know, as part of their really powerful garden city promotion work over the last few years. And the paper really is capturing the spirit of the interwar years around garden city thinking being, having that central belief in the ability of planning and design to positively affect quality of life, therefore health and happiness. And you can see how Dr. McFadden's drawn to that idea of the human body as metaphor for place, where the health of both is depending on achieving and maintaining the right balance. I have to say, Dr. McFadden was a slight vested interest, being the first resident doctor of Letchworth and also a director of First Garden City Limited, so the owners and promoters of Letchworth, so slightly biased paper perhaps. But at the time he was one of the first to sort of recognise these elements of, well, what makes a healthy and happy individual, things that we might now find commonplace and obvious, but that idea is a balance of both heredity and environment. But he was very keen to sort of say that, we can plan for physical environment and social infrastructure, but we mustn't forget heredity, particularly social heredity, about what it means for aspirations, expectations, spirit and dreams of not only our peer group, but over time, over multiple generations going forward. He was keen to point out that we can't really do much about personal heredity, although these days in the world of genetic modification, we don't know. We will see. The paper's really lovely, and you should read it if you haven't already. But it's an almost evangelical sort of endorsement of how garden city planning can make people healthier and happier, backed up though by some good evidence. And he presents various bits of data. And at this time of writing, he's able to reflect on the early years of Letchworth. So Letchworth's now bedding in sort of 20 years at this point. So he's able to sort of pick out some stats. Letchworth's currently, slashing the national average in half in terms of infant mortality. And that, I think, must have at the time been a hugely powerful piece of work when you think about the immediate post-war years, just shortly after this paper was written, the advent of NHS, the New Towns movement, the post-war years. That kind of statistical evidence really must have driven the zeal for new town creation, new town planning that came in the post-war moment. Interesting, as a Letchworth man, he starts to look at Wythenshawe here, and I guess that's a consequence that Wythenshawe at the time was, if you like, a pioneer in planning a place around Garden City principles for the singular purpose of providing a better, cleaner environment for people who needed to be taken out of urban areas that were suffering from quite acute, as you can see, health and social problems. This is Wythenshawe at the time McFadyen was writing, and you can see almost a personification of health and harmony. Why wouldn't we want to live there? I think, the story of Wythenshawe in the post-war years in the late 20th century is perhaps, a story that needs to be told, not in my talk, in a completely different talk, and perhaps even a completely different conference, such are the myriad issues that affected that. But back to Letchworth and McFadyen, this is very much his personification of an environment planned to support health, happiness and harmony. As he puts it, an environment that does not impose nervous or physical strain, orderly development that's bringing people in touch with land, fresh air and sunlight. And overall, and most sort of tellingly really, a balanced physical and social environment that can positively influence social heredity. So he's not just looking at this as a physical entity. He moves on to endorse the wider concept of self-containment, which appeared so strongly in the early work of Howard and his contemporaries at the turn of the century, believing that the Garden City had to be a physical whole and a social unity, one that's independent and surrounded by a green belt. So, big advocate of this sort of utopian model of, a harmonious and self-sustaining series of cities. I think as we move into the 21st century, it's healthy for us to sort of take a sense check on that and make sure, as well as sort of maybe delivering those utopian ideals, we're very conscious of the goal of sustainable development and making sure we are trying to achieve something that's deliverable and sustainable. In the prospectus that many of you will be familiar with from last year, from government inviting invitations from local authorities to make a pitch for large-scale development in their authorities, being given support as garden villages, towns and cities. I think there's a bit of tension there, because even in describing garden villages, which you can see were described as fairly modest-sized settlements of somewhere between 1,500 and 10,000 new homes, and sort of inviting these to be new discrete settlements, almost inviting the notion that these could survive as self-contained or could be designed as self-contained places. And as we saw previously, I think we need to just be careful about doing that and balance that off with ideas of sustainable and deliverable development. Can a garden village of that kind of size, particularly towards the lower end, deliver all the components of a sustainable place that we're all familiar with? And you can see that at the higher end of the hierarchy of components of sustainable place, it's pretty hard to see how a garden village can not only supply but support and sustain those kind of components over time, which leads to the thinking. Well, sorry, a couple of examples. I'll go back. Just out of sync here. It leads to my thinking that rather than that utopian sort of structure, we need to give ourselves a little bit of leeway about decision making on location of new settlements. So, smaller settlements perhaps might need a little bit more support and a relationship with existing social infrastructure and community infrastructure that it can't actually provide itself. So rather than separation through notional green belts, albeit connected, there's perhaps a bit more of an umbilical relationship with an existing place, so it can tap into and indeed help support community infrastructure that's already in place. I think these are important concepts when we think back to the post-war years. Many of you would have heard of the phrase New Town Blues. As people were sort of decanted and put into new homes, yes, breaking up of existing communities had a psychological effect, but also a sense of isolation and badly planned places that weren't well connected into a community infrastructure network had quite profound psychological impacts. We also need to think about giving confidence to investors and developers. These new settlements need to be credible propositions and desirable places and will the market sustain, a leap of faith out into somewhere, whereas they might get more confidence having that umbilical relationship with somewhere that already exists. And let's go back one. There's perhaps fair or unfair sort of media coverage at the moment of some pioneering new settlements, smaller scale new settlements, so the garden village size. Are they sort of meeting those challenges? I don't know these case studies particularly well. Some in the room might know them better than I, so I don't know whether they are fair criticism. But certainly hitting headlines for the wrong reasons, finding it difficult in the early stages to bed down as mature communities, but also developers starting to get a bit cold feet about delivering design quality in terms of market expectation. When we talk about self-containment and separation, we of course think about Green Belt, which was associated with those original concepts. In fairness to the Garden City pioneers, they were always making the point that Green Belt should be useful, beneficial. It's part of the communities that it surrounds. I think over the 20th century that's kind of been lost in a more dogmatic approach to Green Belt policy. And I think in recent years even, I think there's been a healthy challenge of that. For example, around Greater Manchester at the moment, rethinking, Green Belt boundaries to ensure that we are providing for sustainable growth and sustainable placemaking and making sure that our green spaces work for us. They're not just notional green spaces that keep communities apart. And when we come down a scale further, and designing, if you like, a new settlement, designing a garden village, in fact, I think we've got to be careful we don't jump to that immediate conclusion, well, a garden village is simple, isn't it? The more green space it's got, the better. That's what makes a garden village, isn't it? Well, there's certainly some medical studies and medical evidence out there. This goes back a few years now. It's actually an Australian study which kind of demystifies that or debunks that theory, really. It's quality over quantity, absolutely. We should be very careful at just providing space for the sake of it. Very interestingly, in that study, it was saying that it's just pure proximity to good quality open space that makes the difference to mental well-being, not necessarily the access into it and the use of it. And that's could have quite interesting effects for how we plan and design our spaces. On the right-hand side, of course, spaces are not separators of communities; they are binders of communities. Social and environmental inclusion is their role. I won't go into this. Philip made some very good points about long-term stewardship, models for that. We can't go into planning new settlements, garden villages, garden towns without thinking about sustainable long-term maintenance of those environments. So that's a little bit of strategic thought and context. I'm just going to wrap up with some reflections on our work at Holsney. So Holsney Garden Village is one of the 14 announced at the turn of this year, receiving some government support and government funding to try and deliver new settlements with a garden village or garden town ethos behind them. This is Knowsley Borough. For those of you who know it, this is the sort of eastern fringes of Liverpool city region. So we have the M62 coming in from the east. This is kind of as you enter the main body of Liverpool. And it's a site that straddles the M62, so not immediately pleasant in the sense you've got a motorway running through it, but actually an extremely attractive piece of countryside and some superb views across the Mersey Valley. And this was identified very early on by Knowsley Council. This has been promoted by them for many years, actually, and they've actually tried to work very hard with the development plan process to get it released from the Green Belt as a means by which to deliver some step change in quality of housing provision in Knowsley, rebalancing some demographic challenges that they're facing. And the sort of arrival of the prospectus, the Garden Village Towns and Cities prospectus that came out last year was perfect timing for them, really. They were looking for that hook, looking for something which would define for them something different, something that could be delivered against the grain of Knowsley. So the council themselves put together a proposition to government to say we can deliver a garden village in Knowsley. Proposition was accepted. Turley were brought in to try and turn that proposition into planning and master planning guidance and an infrastructure delivery plan. Complex process, not helped by the fact we've got sort of 40 to 50 landowners in there, and it made everything very tricky. But what we went about very quickly doing is trying to organise, well, what can we deliver from our sort of garden village toolkit? And there's some obvious things we've mentioned there on the screen in terms of some principles we think we should be delivering in a garden village of this type. But very early on, we started to hit a bit of a snag with the clients and the stakeholders. We very much bought into this comment in the government's prospectus about, well, garden villages are discrete settlements, aren't they? And you remember that aerial photograph I showed you before. This is not necessarily a detached part of Knowsley. This is attached to somewhere else. But they'd really bought into this idea that this could be something unique, something different, and it almost should turn its back on what's around it. It's only a relatively small developable area. We can only deliver about 1,600 to 1,700 new homes. Say only, that's a large-scale development. But it's certainly not a garden town, it's not a garden city, it's actually a very small-scale garden village. How can we possibly deliver something like that could be self-contained, self-sustaining? And why would we possibly want to do that when we've got, a ready-made network of community infrastructure right on our doorstep that we should be keying into and helping to sustain for the long term? We also have a rail route and a rail station that gets you into Lime Street in 15 minutes. So why would new residents of Holsney Garden Village want to be part of that? So, believe it or not, we had quite a bit of a headache in the early stages trying to sort of go from that previous sort of state of mind to a slightly different way of thinking about this garden village and what it means for Wiston. So here's a sort of an urban design tactics diagram, which is sort of a device for helping communicate those kind of ideas. Is it a garden village? Is it an urban extension? Does it really matter? It's something which is actually adding value. It's putting something back into the communities that it's being built next to, but it's also keying into something which is pretty strong in terms of community infrastructure at the moment. As you move away from those existing nodal points and bits of community infrastructure, we can start to do something which is a bit more distinctive, a bit more of itself. Another sort of image, a sort of vision graphic we were using as tools at the time to try and communicate that for different audiences, what does this development look like? The really interesting part of this, Holsney used to be the Holsney Park Estate, so dating back to the 16th century, our site, which is the site edge red, was actually a historic park with fantastic hall, plantation woodlands in a planned landscape, superb ornamental water bodies, and for many years it was disbanded. Don't get me wrong, we're not demolishing anything to create this garden village. This was disbanded about 100 years ago, so there's nothing there. There's some remnant, obviously, landscape features in it. But it's all been broken up into private ownership and agricultural use. But the thing was, it has a great big sandstone wall all the way around it. There's no public rights of way through it. The communities of Wiston and Knowsley have never been able to access it or use it or benefit from these environmental assets. So that drove us very quickly to the decision that this whole garden village concept should be driven by a green infrastructure framework that is not only providing an armature for housing layout within the site, but is something that we mentioned before as green infrastructure as a means through which to deliver environmental inclusion. This is bringing people in as much as creating an environment for people that are buying into this new place. And of course, there's myriad functions of that green infrastructure, as anybody of you who's mass planned new settlements would know. It's not only routes of movement, but viewing corridors, ecological sensitive areas, those woodland plantations. We were trying also desperately to sort of try and reinterpret that original kind of estate landscape planting plan and try and find it somewhere buried as it is in there at the moment and find that as the armature for the development area. So it's very much driven by that green infrastructure ethos. But paradoxically, it started to present another problem for us. There's too much open space, there's too much green stuff, and it's going to be quite hard to deliver it and maintain it and look after it. So we had an opportunity, and the opportunity was in the very southern part. We've got a piece of land owned by the Land Restoration Trust. It's a former colliery, and they have aspirations to create a country park out of that former colliery. They've been finding it quite difficult, had that aspiration for many years, to make that deliverable and viable. So we came along and said, well, how's about we sort of maybe do a bit of a deal that we could take a bit of that land, turn it over to sort of developable area, and what we could do with you is bring your aspirations for a country park actually linking into the north. Not only that, we can use you as a body, because that's, if you like, your reason for being, your raison d'etre, to actually maintain that in the long term. So some kind of vehicle, some kind of mechanism in the long term that they would take actually stewardship not only of their own country park, but green spaces that thread through the housing layers. That conversation is still ongoing, not resolved, but it's certainly an opportunity. I won't go too much into the image on the right. What that was about is our recognition that we couldn't really, in the context of Knowsley and other issues, political climate, we couldn't really hope to present a design code for the whole lot of this development. But in terms of harmony, we were conscious that there were certain experiences in this garden village that everybody would have a common experience of. So yes, we could start to code key routes, but we didn't have to code everything. And we could certainly start to code who was responsible for delivering what in terms of green space. So I'm just wrapping up. I mentioned before the motorway. We did have quite a battle with the landowners and the council about, well, what is the response to that motorway? We're very much into, well, why should we be putting in a 4 metre high acoustic fence against that and putting development right up against it? This is a garden village. We're delivering a happy, healthy place. So I think the battle is still ongoing. It's not won, but the idea of providing an attenuation of noise and air quality through an environmental corridor, a multifunctional environmental corridor, which will have all sorts of ecological benefits, drainage attenuation, the whole remit. So as I say, we want to sort of try and get a solution to motorway noise and air quality that is not lowest common denominator, and we think that's really important to the garden village thinking. So my final slide is just a bit of a return to McFadyen. He finishes his paper in a really nice, clear, succinct way, so I'm not going to read it. I'll let you read it. I think what he's trying to say is, creating a physical environment and social infrastructure that is a positive influence over social heredity of future generations is something that needs to drive our thinking in the creation of new settlements.